Hey, good evening, everybody, and a special hello to everybody who's there online. It's great to see so many of you here this evening, and you're all very welcome to this, the third of our lecture series on Dante. And I'm genuinely delighted to welcome Professor Dennis Looney here to UCC today. I've been reading Dennis for many years, but I met him for the first time last September at a conference in Notre Dame, and it was really wonderful. When you meet someone you admire and you respect so much in person, and they live up to your expectations, which is not always the case. And I'm delighted to say that Dennis is one of those people. So I'm really delighted that by sheer coincidence he happened to be in this part of the world at this time, and we, with no expense spared, convinced him to come to Cork on what is a rainy day. But I've just looked out the window and the rain has actually stopped. So therefore, spring is officially here, and what better way to celebrate spring in Ireland than a lecture about Dante. A little bit about Dennis for those of you who don't know. Dennis served as director of the Office of Programs and director of the Association of Departments of Foreign Languages at the Modern Language Association from 2014 to 2021. And from 1986, and going back in time here to 2013, he taught at the University of Pittsburgh with secondary appointments in classics and philosophy. Very varied career. He was chair of the Department of French and Italian for 11 years and assistant dean for humanities for 3 years at Pittsburgh. In 2022, he received the James E. Alatis Founders Award from the Joint National Committee for Languages for a lifetime of, and I'm quoting here, a lifetime of exceptional contributions to advancing language and international education. And also the ACTFL Wilga Rivers Award for Leadership in World Language Education. Publications include Compromising the Classics, Romance Epic Narrative in the Italian Renaissance in 1996, for which he received an honorable mention, and the MLA Mariana Scaglione Award in Italian Literary Studies. And also this brilliant book, Freedom Readers, the African American Reception of Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy. And that was published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2011. It really is a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it. He's also co-edited and co-translated Ludovico Ariosto's Latin poetry for Harvard University Press. That was with Mark Costanza. So as you can see, he's a man of many talents. And I believe that today's lecture is going to touch a little bit on this previous work that he did here, but also introduce different writers. And I think we're going to start with contemporary, move on to those writers. And if I'm not mistaken, we might be taking a detour towards the very end, towards the Caribbean, whoever that may be about. So please join me in welcoming Dennis Lee. Now, it was, go to the screen.
I'll take this moment just to thank all of you for coming, and also all of you in Zoom land, and thank Dara for that kind introduction, and all of you for being here, and for Cork, UCC Cork, Dante Center for welcoming me and my English family. My wife in the back corner, Joanna, is from Yorkshire, and her brother and sister-in-law brought us over here on the ferry, and the ferry was called Ulysses, into Dublin. For some time now, I've been collecting examples of writers, Black writers and artists, who turned to Dante, the man in this poem, The Divine Comedy, to explore and articulate the discourse of race in America from the 19th century to today. Examples abound that point to how Dante's critical fortune in the United States is tied closely to the entangled stories of the country's Black and white citizens. That's what I was writing about in Freedom Readers. I keep finding more and more about that. Dante's perhaps unexpected position of importance in African-American culture manifests itself in works that are literary or cinematic, that can be high or low, that can be erudite or popular. Given that Jesmond Ward's recent novel, Let Us Descend, which was published in October 2023, depends heavily on Dante's Inferno as a primary source, it's clear that the pilgrim's epic journey into hell still matters to the telling of African-American history. On the eve of the American Civil War, in her novel, the mulatto protagonist, whose name is Annis, undertakes her own epic journey from the Carolinas across the Deep South to New Orleans. From the rice plantation where she was born daughter of a rape, child of a rape, daughter of the plantation owner, as was often the case. She was taken from that rice plantation to the largest slave market in the South in New Orleans. Annis knows Dante enough, which she learns by listening in on her half-sister's lessons. Annis knows Dante enough to use the Inferno as one of her guides on her journey. The novel is set in the antebellum South, and it reminds us that Dante's poem was indeed a key text for abolitionists in their fight against slavery. William Wells Brown, who wrote the first African-American novel, Cordelia Ray, there's his novel, Clotel, or the President's Daughter, a narrative of slave life in the United States. You can see that it was published in London. It couldn't be published in the US. It came out in 4 different versions, and it is the writing that outed Thomas Jefferson as a plantation owner who also had many, many children from his slaves. William Wells Brown, Cordelia Ray, and Frederick Douglass used Dante in their writings for liberation. So I would love to tell you more about Cordelia Ray and these 2 images on the left, and that's her father, Charles Bennett Ray, on the right. But just go read in Freedom Readers what I say, and then please talk to me about it. There's Charles Bennett Ray's close friend, Frederick Douglass. They all use Dante in their writings about liberation. In the middle of the 20th century, with race relations coming to a boil in the United States, the phenomenon continued. This turn to Dante, Richard Wright, Ralph Waldo Ellison, Spencer Williams, who I think is a neglected genius of African-American cinema, all used the Inferno to map out progressive positions on race in their art. A bit later, Toni Morrison, Amiri Baraka, Gloria Naylor, and others followed suit. Something was definitely in the air. From the 19th century to the present time, African Americans have found in Dante a politically engaged poet who speaks truth to power in a way that resonates with the strange experience of becoming a new kind of American with cultural roots in Africa. African Americans have also recognized in him a craftsman of poetic language who creates a new vernacular from the linguistic diversity around him, not unlike what authors of color in the United States have had to do, what authors of color in other places have had to do, make a new language out of that master language that is there. And in Dante's pilgrimage from hell to heaven, which the poet compares to the story of the children of Israel fleeing Egypt in search of the promised land, African-American writers found an epic narrative model of heightened interest for a people with a memory of slavery. And it just dawns on me, this phrase, memory of slavery, will come up again in my very final remarks. I'm now beginning to integrate that study, as it were, the research of Freedom Readers, with more recent work that looks at not Black writers, writers of color, but white authors from the Southern United States who read Dante in the context of the peculiar American institution, as an American politician in the South, John Calhoun, called it, slavery, and who paid attention to the ongoing problems that have derived from our history of slavery, racism, segregation, systemic inequality, to name a few. Today, I'll share 4 examples, starting with a poet-politician of the 1830s and 40s, Richard Henry Wilde, then on to a female novelist in the second half of the 19th century, Augusta Evans Wilson, then to a man of letters who wrote over the 20th century from the 1920s into the 1980s, Robert Penn Warren. And finally, I will have some comments about Lorna Goodison a contemporary poet from Jamaica, whom you all know very well because she was here last year, and I'm honored that she's on the Zoom. Those names, Wilde, Wilson, and Warren, you might not have heard of, and I'll try to bring them into your mind. Richard Henry Wilde immigrated from here, from Dublin, Ireland, to the United States at a young age. He lived in Augusta, Georgia, where he became a prominent lawyer. He was the state of Georgia's first attorney general, and he was elected to represent Georgia in the US Congress for 5 terms in the 1820s and 30s. After he ran for office and lost in 1835, he took refuge in Italy from 1835 to 41, where he studied and wrote on Dante and Tasso, among other projects. He was likely the person, I think he was the person, but I say likely because I don't have all the evidence to prove this, most responsible for the discovery and eventual restoration of the fresco of young Dante attributed to Giotto's workshop in the Bargello's Cappella del Maddalena in 1840 and 41. His research led him to conclude that it was there. He got money to clean up the chapel, and they found it. Other people took, one person in particular, Seymour Kirkup, took credit for it, but it was Richard Henry Wilde who did the work and who found it. The painting believed to have been made around 1300. Yeah, there it is, sorry, Bargello, and there's the painting, and there's the youthful Dante. Was believed to have been made around 1300, portrays a youthful Dante standing among many of his peers in the ranks of the blessed, an image of the poet in his political prime. It balanced the images drawn from Dante's death mask that emphasized that austere face of exile that we know so well. Overnight, this fresco became a destination for travelers to Florence. Its impact on the reception of Dante in the Anglo-American world was extensive. Wilde's most famous poetic work is a book-length poem, Hesperia, composed as a descriptive catalog of the features and topography of his adopted country, the US, as it continued to expand to the West. He took that title from an ancient Greek expression for Italy, which described it as the land of evening where the sun sets. In one striking passage, which you have before you, the author highlights a sandstone butte, sort of like a mesa, along the Illinois River, whose history reminded him of the story of Ugolino in Inferno 32-33, now called Starved Rock. Its name recalls the legend that a band of Potawatomi Native Americans trapped a band or a group of Illini Native Americans on that big rock. And those trapped Indians chose death by starvation over being massacred by a much larger force. And when he looks up, the poet sees in his imagination this rock, and he says, "What is yon rude and overhanging steep that frowns on Illinois' unmurmuring tide? Fortress or cliff or pharos of the deep? Stern nature's monument of savage pride, the Sioux's tower of hunger, Pisa's keep, amid whose horrors Ugolino died, before that rock of famine well might quail, did but an Indian Dante tell its tale." With his condensed hypothetical expression, did but, Wilde imagines an Indian Dante. If only there were an Indian Dante who might do justice to the starvation of those Illini Indians on a par with what Dante himself did in the episode of Ugolino. Let me unpack this for a second. An Irish immigrant to the US, elected by Georgians to represent them in the US Congress, in a poem on his new country's westward expansion, fantasizes that only a poet of the appropriate native culture and of the caliber of Dante could do justice to the horrific history of one particular place along that river. And the motivating feature that connects all the dots here is Dante. In fact, this canto, you can see it's from a canto called Louisiana. So the Louisiana Purchase, the westward part of the US. Louisiana opens with a view west at dusk that is a translation of Dante's Purgatory, Canto 8, lines 1 to 6. Era già l'ora che volgi di Zio. This poet Wilde, this Irish poet Wilde, repeatedly sees the New World through Dante-colored glasses. At the end of Hesperia, the poet shifts his focus from the American landscape to his works Dedicati, a noble lady from Cosenza. La Signora Marchesa Manfredina di Cosenza, he says. But the scene conjured up by memory fade, prairie, stream, and forest from my view, and hunter, warrior, pilgrim now are shades. Dream of my soul, I am alone with you. Cosenza's streets replace Missouri's glades, and all Calabrian's legends rise anew. The mention of Cosenza prompts a comparison with Dante's Manfredi in Purgatory 3. In that canto, Dante recounts how the bishop of Cosenza had Manfredi's body exhumed and transported out of the church's territory under the assumption that he, like his father, Frederick II, died an unrepentant sinner in opposition to the church, died a heretic. But the pilgrim's exchange with the soul on Mount Purgatory reveals a different story with a happy ending. Manfred's sincere conversion just before dying on the battlefield lands him on the lower slopes of purgatory in Dante's poem, where, to be sure, he will have to spend much time purging his sins, but he's saved, and regardless of how long it takes him to get there, he's on his way to heaven. Wilde stresses that the bishop of Cosenza would not condemn him to excommunication. Instead, his relationship with the lady from Cosenza will be blessed. Yet would not now Cosenza's pastor deal the curse of Manfred's ashes upon mine, come as it will my hour and when and where Cosenza's pastor will bestow his prayer. The scene of Manfred and Dante turns on the fact that what happened to be what appears to be a bleak landscape of gory death, there's another purgatory landscape, a landscape of gory death, is actually a field where hope can take root and bloom. That is, it's a place where Dante's metaphor of the fior del verde, as long as there's a flower of green hope, this can come to life. Wilde's allusion to that passage and his hopeful reading of Purgatory in general is brought to bear on the harsh landscape of the New World, including that rock that called to mind the tragedy of Ugolino. This same passage from Dante's Purgatory, Canto 3, provides Robert Penn Warren with the epigraph and the key idea of hopefulness that works its way through the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel All the King's Men. But before I turn to that novel and to Warren, I want to highlight briefly another 19th century Southern reader of Dante, herself a slave owner from Alabama, who is also especially beholden to Dante's Purgatory. Her name is Augusta Evans Wilson. Dante was required reading in the South, it seems, in the second half of the 19th century, especially among educated women. Jesmyn Ward's Let Us Descend, as I mentioned in passing, builds its plot around this fact because the protagonist, Annis, the slave, hears the educated daughter of the master being taught Dante. Readers begin to appear during and just after the Civil War, none less than Verena Howell Davis, Mrs. Jefferson Davis, that's the First Lady of the Confederacy, displays a keen awareness of Dante in more than one place in her writings. But it's this woman, Augusta Evans Wilson, the most popular Southern author of the 19th century, whose dependence on Dante is noteworthy. In a letter to a friend on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, she writes from her home in Mobile, Alabama, "Could you contemplate a European trip this year?" And then she worries about what's happening and what looks like it's going to happen, Civil War. And then she ends by saying, "I am studying Dante just now and can only say I consider his a great work, and to me it is far superior to Paradise Lost." Her third novel, a so-called plantation novel, think Gone with the Wind, is called Macaria, or Altars of Sacrifice. Published in Richmond, Virginia in 1864, as it was becoming clear that the Southern Rebellion was a military failure, was a political failure. This novel is dedicated to the soldiers of the Confederate Army. The work has a fascinating printing history and reception. A copy was smuggled out of the South through Union blockades into Havana, Cuba, and from there up to New York, where it was republished after all the Confederate propaganda, or much of it, was taken out. The dedication, and it was repackaged for Northern readers as much as it could be. Its title was shortened to Macaria, and it was published a second time in a version new and improved, I thought, for Northern readers. They couldn't get enough in the North of the depiction of the world of the South falling apart. At the same time, readers on both sides were captivated by Macaria's nostalgia for what would come to be called the lost cause, how the noble South didn't deserve to lose the war. It reminds me of, I didn't really lose that election. And you just keep saying, you didn't lose the election, you didn't lose the election. And it becomes part of what you're doing, a cause, the lost cause. Evans would later become, in her life, very, very involved in the lost cause. And she raised money for many of the statues across the South of Confederate heroes that are being taken down in these years. Macaria recounts the intertwined stories of two women, white, one aristocratic, one working class, leading up to and during the course of the war, using Dante's Purgatory in key passages as a text with a message of resilience and resistance for women of the South. The Southern belle, the aristocrat Irene, whose name means peace, finds strength in Dante's image of the humble reed at the end of Purgatory 1, the resilient plant that Virgil uses to prepare the pilgrim for his journey up the mountain. The other woman, Electra, who hopes to escape the limitations of class and gender by becoming a famous painter, is warned by her teacher not to put her faith in fame. Citing Carey's translation, the teacher quotes an extensive passage from Dante's Purgatory, Canto 11, on the transitory nature of fame. Cimabue, here I'm quoting, believed to be the best painter, and it goes on. And at a critical turning point in the novel, Irene rejects the marriage her family had arranged for her, speaking directly to the would-be groom, quote, Dante painted no purgatory dark enough to suit the wretchedness that would result from such an unholy union as ours would be, end quote. Irene, the aristocrat, chooses a path of service and dedicates herself to working for wounded soldiers in war hospitals. And then her path crosses Electra's when the painter uses her as a model for an image of hope for peace at the end of the novel. Dante's Purgatory offers guidance to both these women on how to live a meaningful life in difficult times, in what critics have called a war story for Confederate women. St. Elmo is Wilson's novel published in 1866, just after the war ended. And it is reckoned by literary historians to be the third most printed book in 19th century America, not just the South, after the Bible and Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was wildly popular in the North and in the South. The novel's narrative revolves around the relationship that develops when Edna Earl, the young woman you see there, who clearly is a writer and wants to be a writer, as you can see on the cover. The cover's from 1920s. But and there she is. It's a good depiction when you can see the creepy the creepy man, his name is St. Elmo, looks like Frankenstein around the corner. Her name, the young woman's name is Edna Earl. She finds a copy of the Divine Comedy in the edition translation by Carey with drawings by Flaxman. She finds a copy of the Divine Comedy in front of her grandfather's blacksmith shop. Quote, night and day she pored over this new treasure, sometimes dreaming of the hideous faces that scowled at her from the solemn, mournful pages. And when startled from sleep by these awful visions, she would soothe herself to rest by murmuring a metrical version of the Lord's Prayer contained in purgatory, end quote. She eventually tracks down it happens that she ends up and is able to find the owner and give the owner of the volume back. And that owner is this man, Frankenstein-looking man, St. Elmo Murray, whom over the course of the narrative, she civilizes through her pure love. But civilizing him doesn't make him into a believer of Reconstruction, that is of the aftermath of the Civil War, the attempt to try to reconstruct the South. The Alabama novelists' pro-Southern position ignores, or perhaps it's more accurate to say, will not allow the possibilities offered by the figure of that political abolitionist Dante that is so important to the African-American tradition. But Augusta Evans Wilson found what she needed in Dante, sustenance and support for her and for her readers, for women moving in the world of men, and those men were at war. Her reading of Dante ultimately wasn't radical enough to force her herself, the author, to rethink the racist premises of the economy and the culture of the South in the second half of the 19th century that she's a part of. But Robert Pitt Warren's reading of Dante was, oh my goodness, I forgot about the slide. A new movie has come out, a recent movie has come out in the last 5 years. No, it's 10 years ago, 2013, The Passion of Miss Augusta. And it's 1 hour long. It's by an Alabama filmmaker, Robert Clem. And does a very good job of taking those two novels, Macaria and St. Elmo, and weaving them in and out of the biography of Augusta Evans Wilson. And you can find it on YouTube, and it's 1 hour long. It was done for PBS, for public TV in Alabama. So I recommend it. Oh, this she is. I'm sorry. Yes, so this is in the movie, a still from the movie. She goes into the library and, there she is. Okay, Robert Penn Warren. From a small town in Kentucky, Robert Penn Warren was an outstanding student in the English department of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the early 1920s, when his professor, John Crowe Ransom, held sway over a group of students and young professors, mostly male, but not all. One was a woman named Laura Riding, who became a companion of Robert Graves. Most of them were male, though, devoted to literature, who called themselves the Fugitives. There's 5 of them at the Fugitive Reunion. That's Alan Tate on the left, and there's Warren, who was the youngest of the group, over the back, right behind John Crowe Ransom. They all wrote poetry and prose, fiction and nonfiction, and practiced a brand of criticism that came to be called New Criticism, which was famous, or is famous, for its direct focus on the text itself, not the biography of the author, not the philology of the author, but the text, and nothing but the text. And they all, most of them, wrote institutional textbooks that helped take New Criticism from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s into the American higher education system, into English departments. And in 1950, 60, and 70, everybody who was doing English was practicing it through their methods called New Criticism. In their literary work, they took refuge from encroaching industrialization in the South, promoting a return to an idyllic agrarian past. In the 1920s, that kind of conservatism meant a nostalgia for the antebellum South, that world of St. Elmo and Macaria, inequalities and all. The fugitives morphed into the Southern agrarians of the 1930s, whose collective publication, a book of controversial essays that came out in 1930, I'll Take My Stand, made an appeal to the pre-industrialized aristocratic culture of old Europe. They believed that their romanticized Old South was the link to that past, but the world they imagined actually had much more in common with New Europe in 1930, that is with Nazi Germany and with fascist Italy. Their project, in many ways, was unambiguously racist. Warren is a complicated figure. He grew from a Southern regional writer in the 1920s, and as I said, he was the youngest of the fugitives, into a sometime agrarian in the 1930s. He has an essay in this book that stakes out a place for apartheid, basically, with whites here and blacks there. He was the youngest fugitive. He grew to an agrarian in the 1930s. And that controversial essay that I just mentioned is called The Briar Patch, makes a case for total segregation, separate but equal, he said, Southern US apartheid. But he kept changing, and he changed in the 1940s and then developed remarkably into a proponent of civil rights in the America of the 1950s and 1960s with a book entitled Segregation, and another book entitled Who Speaks for the Negro. Dante marked his way along that transformation. As a young boy rummaging around the attic of his father's ancestral home, he came upon a copy of the Divine Comedy, which had belonged, he was told, to his grandfather. That proved to be auspicious. As I said, he was at Vanderbilt. There he studied Dante a bit in literature courses taught in the English department in translations of Carey and Longfellow. But more important probably was his extramural learning from, especially from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which came out in 1922, which Warren tells us captivated the younger generation of college. Warren, among others, knew it all by heart, knew the entire poem by heart. Eliot's poem, as you probably know, contains 5 major allusions to Dante's poetry, and those references in Eliot are acknowledged in his notes to The Wasteland. So not just the poem, but Eliot's erudite references and explications, not always explanations, but pointing you to where he got his allusions. Scattered remarks in Warren's letters document that from that moment on, from the 20s and 30s on, he's reading Dante on and off in Italian often. While Robert Lowell was at Louisiana State University, where Warren was teaching, Lowell was there working for a master's degree in English from 1940 to 42. He and Warren met, quote, several days a week at 12 o'clock, had a sandwich and a quick Coke, and then we read Dante for 2 hours, end quote. Warren kept at it over the course of his life to the very end, when he reads cantos on his own on his deathbed, then plays back a tape of Rosanna, his daughter, who's a very fine poet in her own right, Rosanna Warren, who reads him the same section in Italian, quote, Dante keeps me from being bored with myself, he said movingly shortly before he died. Substantive allusions to Dante's comedy occur throughout Warren's works, poetry and prose. He notes that his second novel, At Heaven's Gate, came originally out of Dante by a winding path, he says. The moral design of this novel is modeled roughly on a hierarchy of wrongdoing that one finds arranged and punished in Inferno, 7th circle, with its various sins categorized under violence, and the 8th circle with an array of sins of fraud. As happens in many imitations of Dante, Warren uses the system, the structure of Dante's hell, its moral topography, as a loose guide for his own thinking about right and wrong. But it's this book that really does so much. In 1946, All the King's Men was published, and it opens with an epigraph in Italian from Purgatory, Canto 3. This book won a Pulitzer Prize, and Warren is today the only American writer who's gotten Pulitzer Prizes in both prose and poetry. He got 2 in poetry later on. So he was very accomplished and rewarded, prized author. All the King's Men opens with an epigraph from Purgatory 3, where Manfred, teaches the pilgrim that there's always hope for salvation as long as one's faith is genuine at the end of one's life. That same saying that Richard Henry Wilde is interested in. Mentre che la speranza a fior del verde, as long as hope has the flower of green in it. There is hope that the narrative's troubled protagonist in this novel, Jack Burden, will find his way out of that burden, out of the crisis that marks the middle of his life's journey. He is 35, as in this story, even as tragedy unfolds around him. Warren alludes to Dante at various moments, including in a dramatic restatement of Piccarda's line from Paradise 3, in la sua volontade e nostra pace, when the authoritarian demagogue Willie Stark stirs up a crowd with riffs on that line. You know, he doesn't say I'm reading Dante to you, but he uses Dante. Yeah, if you haven't seen these movies, both are worth watching. One is the early first movie, All the King's Men, the one on the left, for which the actor Matthew Broderick, it's Roderick Crawford, won an Academy Award. And then this one that's more recent, 2006, and you can see these faces, Sean Penn, Jude Law, Kate Winslet, Anthony Hopkins. I don't know if it's a great movie, but it's a very, very good movie, and I recommend it. And it's a very good, faithful representation of the novel. And in the novel, there is a lot of Dante. A passage deep in the middle of All the King's Men is noticeably dramatic. Jack Burton, that's Jude Law, who's figured out the essence of Willie Stark's political success, wants to share the revelation with his friend, Dr. Adam Stanton, whom Stark has tapped to be the director of a new hospital. So there's always political corruption in the midst of this story set in Louisiana. Jack narrates their conversation. He, Adam, Jack's friend Adam, rose from his chair, took a couple of restless paces across the frayed green carpet, then swung to face me. Willie Stark needn't think he can flatter me, he said fiercely. Nobody could flatter you, I said softly. Nobody in the world. And do you know why? Why? Listen, there was a man named Dante who said that the truly proud man who knew his own worth could never commit the sin of envy, for he could imagine that there was no one for him to envy. No, you couldn't be, you are that man. No, you certainly couldn't be flattered. Here, Warren loosely paraphrases Purgatory Canto 13, 5 lines, 6 lines, where Dante confesses to Sapia on the terrace of the envious that the sin of pride weighs more heavily on him than the sin of envy. Dante the poet doesn't actually claim that his character, to restate Warren, could never commit the sin of envy. He states rather that he will spend piccio tempo, a small amount of time on that particular terrace when he comes back, when he returns after his death. It's characteristic of Warren's rewriting of Dante that he condenses a significant amount of the original into a single moment, as he does here, announcing outright that Dante is his source. He then crafts one sentence, really, to reflect his adaptation of Purgatory Cantos 10 to 13. This is the way he works. In an interview of 1977, Warren reflects, quote, Dante almost got me at one point, end quote. And in his last major work of prose, A Place to Come To, which was published in 1976, published a year before he made that comment, the novelist explores what can happen to you when you get got by Dante. Warren writes about another protagonist in midlife, Jed Tewksbury is his name, a professor at a school in the South modeled on Vanderbilt University, whose research is on Dante and medieval theories of love. Tewksbury is mired in a mid-career slump. He's lost the will to teach, to pursue his research, even to live. His most interesting course is an informal tutorial on Dante for 2 older non-traditional students, one of whom is his landlord's wealthy aunt. Like Jed, she had spent time in Italy during World War II, fighting alongside the Italian partisans. And one of the partisans became her lover, quote, and while we were snowed in, he'd read Dante aloud to me. Sometimes he would recite it, sometimes he was reading. In late afternoons, in the evening, he had a strong, beautifully expressive voice, the commedia. He could get both the musicality and that brazen clangor, end quote. Jed slowly rekindles his desire to teach, to be an academic, in those tutorial sessions at the end of each week. And every Friday, he looks forward to what he calls Dante Afternoon. He first shows signs of renewed life in a discussion of Purgatory 6. So Purgatory keeps coming back in these authors, to these authors. In Purgatory Canto 6, a passage that you'll know, where Virgil meets his fellow Mantuan, Sordello, a medieval troubadour. The teacher and his students give it a close reading, a kind of new critical reading, with the professor, originally from Alabama, waxing eloquent on the exile of the Southerner in the North. Warren himself had left the South in 1942, returning only for short visits for the rest of his life. Like his protagonist in A Place to Come To, he thought of himself as a man in exile, taking Dante's fate as a model for his own. I'll come to this image in a second. We had come into the passage, I'm quoting now, we'd come into the passage in Canto 6 of the Purgatorio, where Dante and his guide Virgil see the noble figure of the poet Sordello, who interrupts the first word of Virgil, crying out to the fellow son of Mantua, whom he recognizes, that he is Sordello of the same terra. Read it again, I suggested. Read it for the fuller rhythm. She obeyed, winding up with the cry of Sordello. Oh, Mantovano, io son Sordello della tua terra. She looked up meditatively. She repeated the word terra. There'd be no way to translate it, she said. I said, I reckon not. Not land, she said, not earth, not soil, place, home, not fatherland, not patria. Jesus, no, I said, not patria. Then I said, unless you just mean everything together, all the things that you said, the things that made you what you are, the things that made you what you are, and that must be lived by you because you are you. End quote. Here, Warren provides a superb translation, I submit, of terra and the notion of identity that it includes. First, he rejects any meaning of the word as a word with a political sense, which is a semantic weight that fascism gave to patria. Rather, terra is about the totality of the place that makes you who you are. Small town Alabama, whose flaws the narrator repeatedly mentions in this novel. Small town Alabama created Jed, just as Mantua created Sordello. Sordello wrote in Provençal, not in Italian or Latin, and his connection with Virgil occurs through terra, not through place, not through linguistic culture. It's possible that when Sordello interrupted him in that moment, a moment that Warren highlights, in that moment in Dante, Virgil was about to utter the poetic verse that tradition holds he composed for his tomb. Mantua me genuit, Mantua gave birth to me, Mantua made me. That is, I am who I am, Virgil the poet, because of where I come from, no matter how far I distance myself from it. Or as they say, you can take the boy out of Mantua, but you can't ever take Mantua totally out of the boy. Ditto Florence for Dante, ditto small town Kentucky and the South for Warren, who spends much of his life as a professor and a writer in Minnesota, of all places, and then in New Haven, Connecticut, at University of Minnesota and at Yale University. The conversation becomes more personal as Jed and the aunt talk openly about their respective experiences in Italy with the partisans during the war. Of the friend who read her Dante, Sergio was his name, the aunt remembers, he had that deep instinctive piety, that piety for place, and all the blood experience that has gone into the place over the years, end quote. It turns out that Canto 6 of Purgatory was the last bit of Dante that the partisan was reading to her before he was captured and shot in the novel. She then recites from memory the entire second half of Purgatory Canto 6, from Sordello's exclamation to Virgil all the way through to the end, which, as you know, is Dante's most powerful diatribe against political corruption. In Warren's paraphrase and partial translation, quote, on to the end, pouring out Dante's disgust, who found his terra had become a whorehouse and a sty, translating what Dante writes. Dante provides Warren with a way to think about regional identity, with a way to think about land, terra, and all that notion implies, with a way to think about who you are when you are in exile. In times of war, civil war, Virgil's epic tale of rebuilding the city following the war, refracted through Dante's tale, becomes a model for Warren, like his protagonist in A Place to Come To. Warren thought of himself as a man in exile, taking Dante's fate as a model for his own, and Warren, approaching the end of his life, must have found comfort in the poet Dante's ability to successfully complete his life's work at the end of his days, also from, or perhaps better said, because of the advantageous point of view of exile. And now just very briefly, I'm not going to go into detail about this work, but it's an amazingly powerful work that tells the story again of Thomas Jefferson, specifically of a nephew of Thomas Jefferson, two nephews of Thomas Jefferson, who have moved into Kentucky. So they left Virginia, they're in Kentucky. This is 1811. And because they're brutal slave owners, they take one of their slaves and just chop him up in front of all the other slaves to make a point about behavior. There's the first cover on the left. There's he published it in 1953, and then he revised it in 1979. He kept working on this his whole life to try to understand what is it in the author of the Declaration of Independence of my country, the United States of America, that prevented him from ever even acknowledging that his nephews brutally murdered in the presence of their extended family a slave. And then you can see in this most recent printing, they want you to see the axe that got used. It's an unbelievably harsh, long poem in which Dante is key. The main character after Thomas Jefferson in this poem is, quote, RPW, comma, the author, the writer of this poem. So there's a Robert Penn Warren pilgrim and there's a Robert Penn Warren poet in this poem. And he climbs up a mountain and he doesn't make it to the top. He has to go back down. He does it again. Later in the work, there's one incident after another that recalls Dante, especially Dante's Purgatory. But that's for another talk. Here he is when he's revising Brother to Dragons. The next and final author in this roster, Lorna Goodison, also writes about Dante with a strong sense of place and also does so from afar. And here is our good friend and presence, Lorna Goodison. The Martinique writer, Edouard Glissant, in his powerful memoir, Faulkner, Mississippi, points out that the Mississippi of William Faulkner was and still is thoroughly Caribbean, and Louisiana, where Faulkner also lived and wrote, even more so. Glissant mentions the food, the music, the Creole languages, the architecture, and of course, the legacy of slavery shared across the colonial Caribbean and the deep coastal south of the United States. For Glissant, William Faulkner is Creole, and he's a Caribbean writer. If Faulkner is Caribbean, then I want to say, and I hope it's okay, Lorna Goodison, Poet Laureate of Jamaica, is Southern, or at least her Caribbean experience has much in common with the experiences of those Southern writers I've been considering. And one of the key points of contact between Lorna Goodison and her world and the Southern world I'm exploring, it turns out, is Dante. In fact, Glissant could have added Dante to that list of all the things that the South shares with the Caribbean. The terminology of political economy provides another way to say the same thing. Goodison's Jamaica, and there you see it beneath Cuba. Goodison's Jamaica. Is part of the global South, a third world country, a developing country, a country on the periphery, as we used to say. There's another map with high income economies in blue, developing economies in red, Jamaica to the west of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Goodison, who recently retired from a distinguished career as a professor of poetry at the University of Michigan, came to Dante later in her life, as you all know, if you heard her talk about this last year. In an essay entitled Some Poems That Made Me, she notes, I would say that the poem that has had the greatest impact on my adult life is Dante's Divine Comedy. Her extensive collected poetry includes numerous poems inspired by Dante, or Dantesque poems, perhaps none more so than The Road of the Dread, in which the spirit of dread, an awesome spiritual presence, speaks to the reader through images grounded in Dante's poetry. The road, the journey, beasts along the way, light and dark, bread of exile, bread of angels. Many of the recent poems in Mother Muse, for example, are composed in tercets in a Dante-styled meter, a gesture toward Dante's poetic terza rima, and an indication that her work as a translator of Dante is having a profound influence on her own creative expression. Here's her edition of the Inferno that just came out last year that you all were honored to hear her read from. And she has also done translations of Dante's Purgatory, parts of the Purgatory. So her work as a translator of Dante is having a profound influence on her own creative expression. It is to Lorna Goodison's practice of translation that I would like to turn to now. Goodison has recently published, as you know, her version of Inferno, which Beth Coggeshall has labeled a tradaptation, not a translation, not an adaptation, but something that blends those two, a tradaptation. She's published in Purgatory as well, including Purgatory 12, and she has other cantos of Purgatory circulating in draft. She dedicates her translation of Inferno 1 in an earlier version to Derek Walcott, fellow Caribbean poet, who then comes to life in that version, a Virgil who can serve as a guide and mentor. There are, as you all would have seen last year and talked about, other figures emerge and become important in her translation of Dante. Names from Caribbean history filled the translation. In Inferno 2, at the memorable moment when the pilgrim asks, "Who am I to make the trip to the other world?" and reflects, "Io non idea, io non parlo sono," Goodison sings, "But why is me must go? Who says so? I am not Garvey, Nanny, nor Marley." That is Grandy Nanny, Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley, all of whom are important figures in Jamaican history who make repeated appearances in the translation. Caribbean places appear too: the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, Bog Walk Gorge for the River Flexion, Rock Hall for Dante's Rubaconte. In her Inferno 15, Brunetto Latini morphs into Teacher Brown, and the earthworks of Dante's Seventh Circle are compared to thick mud walls to keep out the sea in places like British or French Guiana. Goodison adds women to the circle of sodomites. We are all professionals of true worth, men and women of letters, scholars of high renown. But the most surprising change of all is the sound of the Jamaican patois. Spirits are duppies, a word that occurs 5 times in Canto 15. That's when Teacher Brown, on the verge of racing off at the end of the canto, proclaims, "In my words, I am alive and I am no duppy." One group is called the Done Dead Already Band, and the pilgrim wants to know, quote, "Who was down here with him in hell's hot sands for manner born to just come around?" This is a new Dante, a melodious Dante. I think it's a magical Dante. I want to set the scene for looking at the end of Purgatory 12, which Lorna has translated. An angelic guide, whom Goodison calls the key man, leads Dante and Virgil to the inner edge of the terrace of the proud, from which they began to make their way up to the next terrace. The pilgrim, feeling lighter, senses a newly found spring in his step. Unbeknownst to him, the angel has removed the first of the 7 P's etched on his forehead, the one representing the sin of pride. Now purged of that particular sin, Dante no longer bears its specific burden. To help him understand what has happened, Virgil anticipates the moment at the top of Mount Purgatory when all the P's will have been erased, making the pilgrim even lighter still, which prompts Dante to reach up and feel his brow. This, in the original text, Virgil prompts Dante, takes 6 lines, the pilgrim acts 9 lines, then the guide smiles 1 line. Lorna Goodison's version is exactly the same number of lines, but emphasizes the parts in this little skit differently. Virgil speaks at much greater length. 12 plus lines. The pilgrim takes quick action in 2 lines, then the guide smiles. By emphasizing Virgil's comments, Goodison's rendition throws the pilgrim's reaction into sharp and released focus. As we were trying to go up the stairs, so you see this, and then at the bottom, Master, I asked him, what kind of heavy weight has been taken off me so that I can now barely feel exhaustion or fatigue as I proceed on my way? He answered, when the peas that still remain on your forehead, though they are now almost gone, like this first one, when they are erased, then your steps will be cushioned by compassion, and you will no longer feel any exhaustion. Instead, you will go upward singing like the poor people of our country who do not notice that they still bear the weight of slavery days on their heads, except when some passing scholar mentions it. And that is when you reach up a hand and touch and feel it, and so they remind themselves. I cannot always put my finger on why I always carry this load, like this. I spread my fingers and found that only 6 of the P's the key man had marked on my brow remained. When he saw this, my noble guide smiled. Goodison finds a space within the purgatory to address the most defining of colonial institutions, slavery. Slavery days calls to mind the work of the enslaved, sun up to sundown, day in, day out. Our country is Jamaica, but it could be the southern U.S. too. It could be U.S. Weight is the burden, literal and figurative, of that enforced labor. Goodison has her Virgil speak, not as a scholar who knows this history from a book, but as someone who has this history in his bones, who knows it in a psychosomatic way. Like the translator, this Virgil is a descendant of enslaved persons. Goodison's version definitely highlights how the trauma of slavery leaves its mark on a person, body and soul. Her Virgil explains that slavery afflicts and defines those people with experience and a memory of it. Empathetic readers can try to reach up and feel that weight themselves, but not everyone can or will. It is a tough assignment. The pilgrim may be purged of pride in the original, but in this powerful translation, souls still bear the weight of slavery days on their heads, though they do so unawares till some scholar reminds them of it. The translation shifts from the third person plural to first person singular, from they to I, from the poor people of our country to the poet speaking in her own voice. I cannot always put my finger on why I always carry this load, but in some undefinable way, reading, translating, rewriting Dante helps Goodison bear that load. The purificatory walk, the purgational walk of artists and everyone else making their way to heaven requires them to take on the moral challenge of bearing their respective loads. For Lorna Goodison, it's working out the burden of slavery days. Whereas for Richard Henry Wilde, Augusta Evans Wilson, and Robert Penn Warren, the burden is their participation in the colonial legacy of slavery and its aftermath as authors of the South. Purgatory attracted their attention as the canticle of moral progression, of movement onward and upward, of hope and hopefulness, and they turned to it repeatedly in their work. The African-American authors I discuss in Freedom Readers, for their part, seem to concentrate their energies and attention on rewriting Dante's version of hell. For the Black inhabitants of the South they come from is a hell to escape and to critique from, if possible, a safe distance. For white Southerners in the 19th and 20th centuries, their homeland is a purgatory they hope to endure in the hopes of a better future to come. Goodison's Jamaican Dante is perhaps somewhere between these two extremes. Over the last 200 years, both Black and white readers of Dante from the deep global South know better than to be looking for paradise in the place that they call home. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this now. Okay, I think you all agree that was quite wonderful. And I love that you began with Jessamine Ward, who I read recently, a fantastic novelist, and finished with Lorna Goodison, who, as I said, was here reading from her Inferno. But what I think really struck me while you're talking about it, and you touched on it at the end, bringing it together, was this kind of concentration on purgatory.
Yeah.
As a space that is speaking, this canticle that is speaking to these writers. And it was also lovely that you were able to read from Lorna's Canto 12 of the Purgatory that she did for Nick Cavely and for Bernard O'Donoghue, who are also speakers of this Dante, which is from years gone by. So there's kind of a lovely symmetry to all of this. Can I just get you to maybe talk a little bit more about why purgatory? Because when we think of Dante reception around the world, and you yourself are part of that wonderful new book that came out with University of Notre Dame Press, American Dante.
Yes,
There tends to be this concentration when we think about Dante and how he's appropriated or repurposed or repackaged with the Inferno. And this, I find this fascinating what you're talking about, because all of the examples you're giving came from purgatory. And hope. But also, when I think about purgatory, I think about Purgatory, Dante's Purgatory, that what you have, where there is no kind of proper consciousness of sin in the Inferno, at least on the part of the damned. There is on the part of those who are purging their souls in Dante's Purgatory. So there's a consciousness of what they are doing. There is hope, but there is also an acceptance of guilt. And they're trying to undo it. And would that in any way, do you think, add to what you're talking about?
Very much so. Thank you. It's a good segue into our next part of this conversation. I don't want to simplify. I'm always asking myself, am I oversimplifying and say one set of writers does Inferno, another set does Purgatory, because there's a lot of sampling going back and forth, but it does seem, I was struck that first Edna Earl, that is the character of August Evans Wilson, is just obsessed with Dante. And then, the First Lady of the Confederacy is, if not obsessed, is thinking a lot about Dante in the middle of the Civil War. And so, but what they're talking about is purgatory. What they're pointing to is purgatory. And that made me think, okay, what is purgatory? What does purgatory offer someone like that? And hopefulness is part of it, but also it's an acknowledgement of the necessity of labor to get beyond the place where you've come from. There's a certain kind of labor, and so labor working through the sin as they make their way up the mountain, as you know from reading Purgatory, it can take a long time to get to the top. But as you also know, once you've made it to the very bottom of the shore, you're a shoo-in. You're going to be a saint. You're going to be a star. You're going to make it to heaven. But it can take almost forever to get there. And so purgatory is hard work. And the Inferno, to be in Inferno, I don't want to say it's not hard work, but you're just stuck. And that's that. That's a different kind of difficulty. Purgatory is a very, it's a difficult, the experience of purgatory, as Dante portrays it, is an experience in the present tense. And in fact, if you look at purgatory in the Italian, you'll see over and over again the grammatical construction of the gerund, purgando, facendo, andando. And then this great moment, I think it's in Purgatory 6, where Virgil says, you can talk to him, that soul over there. We can interact with that soul over there, but in andando, però pur va, e in andando ascolta. Keep going, and while you're moving, you can listen. In andando. And in andando, Dante's still trying to create a language. He's trying to figure out how to write in Italian. In andando is, it's an interesting sgrammaticato. I don't know if it's grammaticato, but it's an interesting way to emphasize the gerundiveness or the progressive tenseness of the gerund. And those are, without question, in Purgatory, there are gerunds everywhere. It is the progressive canton. the canto of progression, more progression. So back to your observation, you have to work your way through, and you have to repent. That's what Manfred is about. Acknowledge what you've done, and then work your way through it. And that's a burden. And that's what Lauren Goodison is hinting at as well. But you can forget it every now and then someone will remind you of it, and you've got to go focus on that. I don't know if that I'm talking around it a little bit, but
and does it matter what these writers that you're talking about? I'm talking about these white Southern American writers. Does it matter that if they're using either Carey or Longfellow, or is that not a consideration?
That's a good question, and I'll dig deep to see if I can figure that out. Robert Penwarren reading in Italian.
Right.
He doesn't meditate that I have seen on the gerund, the form of progressive state, but he's reading very closely. He's a close reader. I think many people would say that Augusta Evans Wilson is not a close reader. She's kind of a sloppy reader. Richard Henry Wilde, I didn't get to say, because there's never enough time to say everything you want to say. Richard Henry Wilde wrote a 2-volume book on Tasso, and then he started writing a book on Dante, and there are 800 pages of an incomplete manuscript in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. that are, haven't been studied enough. And I've gone and looked at them, and various people over the last century have gone and looked, and you can see some people make markings and things. And so Richard Henry Wilde knows Dante well. And that would be an interesting place to go look and see. But Richard Henry Wilde is doing a sort of history of Dante's time. It's called Dante's Life and Times, his manuscript. And that might show something, because he's a poet and he's a good reader. He's just not as systematic as Warren is. Warren read the whole poem, then rereads it and talks about that at times. Mentioning Warren and Wilde reminds me that I could also say something about purgatory as the canticle. We were talking about this earlier. The canticle of art, the canticle of artists, and being an artist and being a translator for that, being a translator, which is being an artist, is hard work. And there's something progressive and purgatorial or purificatory about that process, And so Dante, the poet, is focusing, it's where he gives a self-definition of him, where he gives his self-definition as a poet. And that's where the greatest gerund of all is there in Purgatory Canto 24. Sorry about this, I forgot it. Poetando, right? There are great passages.
Vox significando.
Yeah, vox significando. Yeah, that's in Purgatory 24. Poetando is Statius converted.
Poetare mi dava un intelletto.
There you go. Yeah. So the connection between all that we're talking about and art is very, very tight.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it is, as you mentioned, it's kind of countable, where art, the poetry in particular, becomes a major focus for Dante, and especially with a number of poets that he encounters on the mountains. Now, I've taken up all this time. I'm sure there are questions in the room or there are questions online. Please do not be shy. Let's see that. Please come up to the microphone so those of those online can actually hear the question.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could say something more about, you mentioned Dante as a poet who speaks to power. So all the invective, let's say, force of Dante, if this becomes evident in some of the authors you're focusing on. On a political side, how is Dante exploited on a political?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. In Freedom Readers, so I haven't said this yet, but the thing I'm working on right now, I'm thinking of is Freedom Readers Part 2. In Freedom Readers Part 1, in that first book on African Americans, those writers cling to Dante because Dante can stand up to injustice and call it out for what it is. And they're very interested, every single one of them Cordelia Ray, whom no one's heard of, but she's a very important writer, Frederick Douglass, all the way down to Toni Morrison and Ralph Waldo Ellison, whom everybody has heard of, and Jesmond Ward, in this recent novel. They admire in Dante his ability to fight back, right? And even if they don't know the biography very well of Dante as a political figure, of that young Dante who gets exiled and then is sentenced to death, who continues to fight and then finally starts fighting in his poem, in his writing, from 1307 to 1321. They've learned through the abolitionist tradition, it's a Quaker abolitionist tradition, that Dante is a symbol of liberty, an idiosyncratic symbol, but Dante is a symbol of freedom and liberty, and they take that. The writers that I'm writing about in Freedom Readers Part 2, whatever it will be called, these different set of writers, white authors who go through, many of them, this kind of racist, who are grappling with the racist American tradition. If they understand that, and I think Robert Ben Warren understands that, they've shifted the discourse to focus on another aspect of Dante, and that's Dante as symbol of hope. Because Warren never says Dante reprimanded me and made me stop being a racist, but Warren is very interested in his own identity and the identity of, in that episode from Purgatory 6, he's interested in identity. Who are you? What made you who you are? How is it that you're a racist or not a racist? If you came from there, then do you have to be that way? And he's trying to grapple with all that and trying to explain himself to himself. And that has a lot to do with the way he interprets Dante as a powerful author, speaking truth to political power. I'm just talking around your question, but Warren is that, and I think Lorna Goodison is doing the same kind of work in Purgatory and in Inferno. And in Inferno, I was going too fast and not reading at the end everything. Lorna, as I'm sure you heard, champions Louise Bennett, a vernacular poet in Jamaica, as her, I don't want to say her real guide, her number one guide, her, I don't want to say her favorite, but a poet can have, a translator can have different guides. And so Lorna as well is interested in Dante and interested in other figures who speak truth to power.
So we have Federica Colucci.
Yes,
I just want to say welcome to Federica, who is a member of the Centre for Dante Studies here in Ireland and was with us for many years. Hello, Federica. Good to see you.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me fine?
Yes. Hello there.
Hi, Denise. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I would have many questions, but the first thing I want to say is to thank you for bridging something like the relation between reading and receiving, between the act of reading and the act of creative, political, critical reception. You highlighted it beautifully, and I think this is a very important aspect of what we do as reception scholars and reception historians as well. I would have many questions, but I was wondering if in charting this landscape that you are, have you considered the dynamics of the circulation of books in the South, and so how the acts of reading are also shaped and influenced by certain dynamics of circulation and transmissions of books of secondary as well as secondary literature as well as primary sources on Dante? And my other question, perhaps connected, is related to forms of publication, because of course we have quite a lot of retellings of one's experience of reading Dante or transformation to novelistic writing of the experience. But what about periodicals and the way they afforded women in particular a space for engaging with political discourse, literary discourse, and so on, and making Dante present or using Dante as a way in.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Federica, and thank you for being here, but also for your own work on these kinds of questions. I'm learning a lot from you the more I read. Speaking of reading, there is a topos, or in the structure of slave narratives, there is often a moment where the slave, it often turns on learning how to read. That is, the slave is barred from reading, and then a good-hearted, it's always a person, a white person, often, it's not always, but often, most often, enables that person of color to read, and then everything changes, right? And so it is wonderful for me to see, or it's interesting for me to see that structural component of the typical slave narrative fused into the narrative of Dante reception, and in all these different kinds of readers. So for Jesmyn Ward's character Annis, it's oral, A-U-R-A-L, right? She hears it, she doesn't read it, she hears it, and she gets it into her head, and then she can say it over in that way. So there's reading, and then there's listening, and those are important things to think about in reception of these stories. And again, what I'm appreciating from your question is the overlap of the structural component of a slave narrative, or what we call a slave narrative, and what happens in almost all these stories, and almost all these authors document the moment when they get their hands on the text and open it and see it and then reflect on it. And I meant to say, I could have said more about this when I showed those stills from the film, The Passion of Miss Augusta, where you see her go into the library, there's a bust of Dante, okay, that's giving you the clue. And then she reaches up and she grabs the book there. In the novel itself, as I mentioned, she finds the book on the ground outside her grandfather's shop, and she opens it up and she's astounded, and she sees some Italian written in the end papers of the book. There's a detailed description of the book as a material object, and that's fascinating. So these authors, not all of them, but some of them, are very interested in the material thing that is enabling their reception, and they're interested in the process by which they can gain access to it, and they're also emphasizing often the luck with which the serendipity that happens. Warren reads Dante in Italian, as I said, with Robert Lowell and some of his buddies, and he reads it in I found out about the text, it's Vandelli text. Later, at the end of his life, when he's on his deathbed, he's reading in Singleton's translation and text. So these authors are interested in the textual, material quality of their experience. And as far as studying circulation of books in the South, I haven't done that enough. I mean, I've tried a little bit to look at the education of women in the South, and it's too much to hope for a syllabus or a curriculum sheet that will tell me what they're doing at this college or that college. But I'm in the process still of trying to reconstruct what a person like Verena Howell Davis, or Augusta Evans Wilson would have, what they would have studied in their education, and how might that have put them on towards Dante. As forms of reading, forms of publication is another part of your question. That's a good one as well. Yes, but these women, especially Augusta Evans Wilson, were invited to, or took advantage of, the periodical network, where they could publish short versions of what they were writing. And that did happen with her, and that happened also with some other of these figures that I've got in the longer version of this paper. So periodicals are an important part, as are letters, right? The letters that they're writing to each other or sharing amongst themselves. So all of that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, so before we go, are there any final questions? Now would be a good time. Okay. Okay, before we thank Dante for my time, I just want one or two announcements. Next week's lecture, which was due to take place in G27, will in fact be taking place online. So you don't have to come in next Monday evening. It will all be happening online for a whole series of reasons. Professors can't come down from Dublin, and that is going to be a lecture with the title De Fruta Vulgare Eloquentia on Joyce's Eloquent Vulgarity. So it's going to be a paper on Dante and Joyce, which I know is a topic that is very much close to some people's hearts. And we're going back to Monday because we're enough of this bank holiday business. But again, that's going to be purely online. So if you will see in the emails, there is a registration form. We ask people to fill out the registration form because many years ago we got Zoom bombed and we learned to our cost that is not a great thing. So we like to know who's going to be online and who's not. So but yes, so that's going to be online. And then the following week, which will be our final lecture, we're going to be welcoming back to court Dr. Leila Livraghi, who was here doing a postdoc a few years ago, and she is coming over from the University of Pisa, and she will be talking about Dante's status and the authority of Virgil. So it's bringing her kind of classical knowledge to bear on these texts. So Dante and Joyce next week online, Dante and essentially the classical tradition as our final lecture for this year's series. Now, they often say that at the midway point in a lecture series, there's a bit of a slump. We're kind of, okay, we've got to this one. But I have to say that tonight's lecture has been absolutely brilliant about material that I think many of us knew very little about. I certainly learned a whole range of different things and authors that I know I'm going to be buying online this evening when I get home. But it really was a fascinating lecture. Started with quite a brilliant talk about Jesmond Ward, who was an up-and-coming, well, she's a very established novelist at this stage. And I loved when you mentioned there at the end that, this arrow tradition that she hears her Dante is a fantastic thing. And then there's this whole matrilinear thing involved as well, which is absolutely fantastic. Then to see all these writers predominantly from the 19th century into the 20th century, but to finish up then on that wonderful poet, Lorna Goodison, who we can see on screen at the moment, and it is wonderful to see her. Hello, Lorna, wonderful to see you. And and to have her to have Dennis talk about her Purgatory translation, which I hope there will be much more of in the months to come.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Dante the poet says to the reader in Inferno 17, Lettor ti giuro per le note di questa commedia. It's one of the times when he uses the word comedy. Reader, I swear to you by the notes of this comedy, what I saw, I really saw, right? It's Geryon, it's this gigantic monster coming to pick him up and take him down, Orsi discende per si fatte scale, a strange kind of set of stairs here. But what I wanted to emphasize is le note. It's the notes of the comedy that Annis hears. So Annis is actually experiencing the Divine Comedy. The protagonist in Jesmond Ward's novel, this African-American mulatto child, is experiencing the Divine Comedy in the most authentic way imaginable. And that's what I hear when I read Lorna Goodison's translation. I think I use the word melodious. I hear this melody. It's melodious. I think I may have said it's magical. It's a new Dante, and I want to encourage Lorna, not putting her on the spot, but encourage her to keep going, and keep going, because what has come is beautiful. And I mean, it's a beautiful translation in lots of different ways, but it sounds it sounds meaningful. And that is very Dantesque, you know, that.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And also Dante's first readership, or those who listened to the poem.
Yeah.
And there is that spoken element to it, which is really, really important. So thank you, Dennis. That was absolutely brilliant. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Federica. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Enjoy Cork.